The Sabaean culture in the Iron Age left several things that are very interesting. One of them is this green bronze statue. The statue, you can see, has very telling imagery when you look at it. The hair seems to be African, the beard seems to be African, but this does not matter whether or not it's African, because we do know the evidence that the Sabaean kingdom was in direct contact at this time with the Horn of Africa. In fact, we know that they sent several missions to try and colonize different places in the Horn of Africa. From this point forward, the Horn of Africa and Yemen, Saudi Arabia would go back and forth with colonizations. With beautiful images, you can tell that these people were exchanging with each other, putting proofs and evidence to these places. But here's something interesting. If we look at the Sudanese of the time, who were dressed as Egyptians, looked like Egyptians, built stelae like Egyptians, and basically did everything, these people in the Horn of Africa were pressuring those type of people, including a second group called the Nobai, which some people assume that's where the word Nubian comes from, even though most people think it comes from the word Nuba, a word for gold in ancient Egyptian. We then look back at the Horn of Africa and we see that the inscriptions, the early writing that you see is Sabaean, meaning that a lot of the Sabaean writings, the Yemenese writings, from about 1000 BC to about the AD period came from the Saba time, but the Hamorites were taken over by the Ethiopians at some point. The blood would mix back and forth, and we would get an interesting look at the people. We know that very far into the kingdoms of Arabia, these desert dwellers, there would be camels being chased by Assyrians a couple hundred years before the Sabaean kingdom's height. So we know that at least in the far reaches of the Yemenese kingdom, there were Arabs who looked something like this. But if we push back, we know that there were Arabs or Yemenites that look like this. Two completely distinct appearances. These are some of the oldest ones, and they look very interesting that they are not the same as either. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because there is a difference between the Assyrian Empire. If we put the map there, you can see that the Assyrian Empire kind of neglected the area of Saudi Arabia and of Yemen. We can see that they've always kind of been out of the game for the most part when it comes to empire. And then all of a sudden they jump in and they become this sophisticated place. But how did they get there? How is it that this place that people are claiming is responsible for civilizing some parts of Africa, how come it seemed like it needed desperate civilizing? And just in case some people think that, well, maybe the civilization came through the route traveling through Israel. The Israelis only started having writing in the 14th century BC, while the Egyptians had writing 3000 BC. Now, this contradicts a lot of things because we would have a lot of images like these, which some people claim come from Sumeria or any of those places, but this has been pushed back on 100% because all civilizations that are close or related to the Middle Eastern, close to Egypt, they have nothing close to what the Egyptians had in sophistication and in timeline, which is very important. Everything that seems to be sophisticated and well done seems to come from Egypt, not come into Egypt, meaning that Egypt was kind of an isolated nation. outside of contact with the Nubians. And of course, we see that these images were found in Nakada, and they were found in those areas of northern Nubia and southern Egypt. So this was a contentious area between the two tribes of northern Nubia and southern Egypt. So if we see these images, which have nothing to do with Yemen, they have nothing to do with Israel, then we can conclude one thing, and that is that both areas didn't put in any work. Maybe they put in work in Ethiopia later, 1000 BC. We see it. We know that it happened because we can see actual cultural input from both lands, Ethiopia to Yemen and Yemen to Ethiopia. We even see the Ethiopians affecting other people at the time, so we know that they did great journeys. We saw, like we said, with the kingdom of Kush, that the with the kingdom of Punt, the land of Punt, we saw that the Egyptians had contact with those people way before they had contact with the Yemenites. So this development, this understanding, this world that the Arabians developed or invented Egypt, it never made sense. It can't make sense. It's broken. Speaking of the Assyrians, I love how everyone seems to arrive at specific places at the exact right time. For example, if we look at these images of the 25th dynasty pharaohs, we can see that it started around 900 BC, where they started gathering some places in Egypt. And then in about 744 BC, we have actual takeover of Egypt. Now, the thing that's interesting is that when the Middle Easterners colonize Egypt, they draw the Egyptians as Nubians. And of course, it's the 25th dynasty. And the military that is captured is drawn as Nubians. But did the Nubians not use native Egyptians for their wars? Did they only bring their people to fight their wars? Why is it that all the soldiers that are being captured are all Nubians? Why are they all drawn the same way? And if you can see with that camel one that I showed you, that people who look different from Arabia getting chased by camels, you can see that they look very different from these Nubians. Why is it that in the time, 25th dynasty, when they took over, that none of these people look anything but Nubian in Egypt? Does this mean that at this time, that genetically they had shifted then? Because that would be another problem to say that they genetically shifted. It would throw away this concept that the genes of Egypt did not shift at this time. Of course, I want people to do the DNA, by the way. I am very eager to find out what they will find when they go to the 25th dynasty and do DNA tests. If they find that they're mostly Asian, I will, and I have to say this, I will stop taking DNA seriously, because nothing about these people is Asian. Nothing about their location, nothing about their personal reports, nothing about the reports of others. Nothing, all evidence points to the opposite. But I want this period to be genetically tested, and I want some people to explain to me why the front line of the Nubian army does not have any Egyptians in it, at least the ones that are being depicted by the Asiatics that took over.